Everybody for our last panel. You never want to speak right after lunch, so we'll run this with a lot of interaction and a lot of questions, hopefully. So we're going to talk about agents of change and business as an agent of change. My name's Andrew Spicer. I'm a professor at the Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina, and happy to be part of the Rule of Law and Just Track down at the University of South Carolina. And I teach in a business school, so I take this from a little different perspective, and I teach classes on international business and public-private partnerships. And to set up this panel, just as a little bit of introduction, I'm going to ask the three questions which I usually ask around these sort of questions. The first is, why does business care? So we hear a lot about policy. So why does business care? Why does society care? And then how do the two meet? Where do business and societies and policymakers come together? So just listening to the conversation this morning, see why do business care? I think we'll get into some questions of motivations today, but I heard a lot of arguments. There's moral and strategic reasons. So is there a moral philanthropy? Some people talked about that. Corporate social responsibility. And strategic, you get risk and opportunity. We heard a lot about risk. I always say that's what lawyers talk about. They want to look at the risk. When you get the CEO in the room, they want to talk about opportunity. And the question of whether there's opportunity in business, and we heard some that this is much more motivating to business. Now, the question of why does society care is interesting. I actually don't think you can have a conversation around rule of law without bringing business into the picture, and I think that's the big idea of having one on private engagement. Business is a partner, potentially, so how do we think about them as a partner as well? But the real tricky question comes down to, where do they meet? How much is enough? And I think we heard that when I always call them dueling case studies. Someone's going to tell you one story of something really horrible, and someone's going to tell you another story of a business who did something really wonderful. For businesses, the practical question is, how much do you do, and what can you do, and how can you do it? How do you align that into your capabilities? And these questions about rule of law are really interesting because it's important to distinguish between law and rule of law. Changing law, and if we think about it in terms of lobbying, is very different than going to a society where they don't have a rule of law. So you hear it as a syndrome. Without a rule of law, anything you do has lots of problems. And I like to say I heard a lot of conversations where it's almost a social movement. We're talking about long-term changes. And so you get, how much can a business be involved in a social movement of talking about change, which is 20, 30 years from now, if you think about climate change or other issues like that. And so I think these questions of change and what's the purpose of business and how they get involved sort of motivates the questions. And I gave some questions around that, which is, well, what works? What can businesses actually do? Where are examples of what your company did or who you worked with, which had some sort of impact? Another one is, why did the company do it? Is it usually a mixture of motivations, or why do firms do this over time? A third question relates to the boundary setting. How do we create boundaries around it? When does rule of law become politics? When don't you get involved and sort of think about those sort of issues? And the fourth question was really around advice. What advice would you give a corporation which was just starting out? So those were very broad questions. We were going to start out with just everyone introducing themselves. Everyone's bio is in the packet. I'm not going to go over it in great detail, other than to say that we have a great diversity of opinions. We have corporations, we have NGOs, we've got advisories, we have a security perspective around these issues. So we'll do introductions to begin with, and then ask a couple questions, and we'll open up to the audience. So we're going to start with Teresa.
Thank you. And it's my privilege to be here today, not just on this talented panel and the panels that preceded us, but in the room with all of you. I'm deeply impressed with your background and your commitment to the rule of law. When you think of LexisNexis, where I am from, most people think, oh, I used you in law school, or I worked with a law firm and we got our laws through your services. And that is a component of who we are. But most people are not aware that we've had a corporate mission for several years to advance the rule of law around the world. When Hamid started the panel this morning, I thought it was very interesting that he didn't give a definition. And one of the things our CEO did when we decided that this would be our corporate mission, he tasked my boss, the executive vice president and general counsel of LexisNexis, to gather this together for our very large company and to figure it out? Well, the first thing he did is read all of the definitions out there, the UN and others. And what he found was that there was no one simple definition that could be, first of all, easily understood, second of all, memorized and repeated easily. And so he took the key components of a number of definitions and crafted it into one that could serve as a template for not just the leadership of our company, but the 10,000 employees around the world who are deeply committed to this corporate mission. So let me walk you through that definition. The first element is transparency of the law. Is it written down? If you're thrown in jail, can you read the law? Can your lawyer read the law, or your family? Does it have a retroactive effect where something that you've done suddenly violates the law? That's the transparency of the law. Access to legal remedy, and true legal remedy. So is there trust in the legal system that people will bring a case there and believe in that outcome? If it's not there, then there's a problem. Equal treatment under the law. If the law applies to two individuals and it treats one differently because of their race, their religion, their gender, something about them that they cannot or do not choose to change, then that's a lack of equal treatment under the law. And then finally, an independent judiciary. Is the law being interpreted by the law itself, or is there something external to the law, like the panel's talking about corruption or bribes, that is changing that outcome? When all of these elements are in place, it's almost like building your house on a stable foundation. But imagine what you would do if you were building your house on a foundation that was cracked or worse, broken. It wouldn't stand. And so all of the efforts that we're doing to advance the rule of law starts with that definition. As background, let me say that my path to where I am now is a bit unique in that I started in advocacy, and it was state advocacy, and I've been doing that for more than 20 years. Within our parent company, now called RELX Group, I was the head of our state advocacy program. My first touch into the rule of law was through those efforts, where I worked with my colleagues at LexisNexis, and we looked at the laws across the United States on anti-human trafficking. So going back to that definition, I'd say that there's a few things it might touch, but equal treatment under the law is definitely one of them. We found, and this was 8 years ago, that there was a real gap in protecting citizens, criminal penalties, and education. We worked with colleagues at the American Bar Association, Polaris Project, and the Uniform Law Commission. It was a 3-year effort, and we helped enact the Uniform Act on the prevention of and remedies for human trafficking. It has been my privilege to be deeply involved in our rule of law efforts since that time. So with that, Andy, I'll turn it back to you.
Sure. We're going to have everyone introduce themselves at first. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, everybody. I'm Arvind Ganeshan, and I'm the director of the Business and Human Rights Division at Human Rights Watch. And our job is to investigate situations where business or economic activity have an impact on human rights. And in that capacity, we work all over the world in looking at different industries like the extractive oil, gas, and mining industries, or the telecom and internet industries, or labor issues on construction sites, and a range of issues. And what we try to do through our work is to work with those companies and institutions to try and prevent these things from happening in the future, and ultimately developing standards where they don't exist, or to strengthen standards where they do. And the interesting thing about business and human rights work since its inception is, in part, it is a response to the lack of rule of law. The fact that governments weren't enforcing existing law, or the law didn't really exist to address the problems we were seeing, whether that's a company paying security forces abroad that are committing abuses, or whether it's a government that's not adequately enforcing its labor laws, or other issues. And over the years, what we've learned is that part of the challenge we face in making sure that companies respect human rights and creating the kinds of environments on the ground that would allow people to benefit from a lot of different things as opposed to be harmed from them is that the legal regimes are weak, but also the standards don't exist. So a big part of the way we think about these issues is that it's not just good enough to expose the problems we see, but that has to translate into norms over time. Otherwise, what you'll be doing is continuous triage of problems that are never going away, as opposed to creating the foundation to try and solve them permanently. And in that respect, I really think there's several ways to think about how a company interacts with the rule of law from the perspective of business and human rights. The first is to remember that most of the norms we think about on an individual basis, labor laws or food safety laws or anti-corruption laws or increasingly laws that touch on human rights or regulation, did not start as laws. They started as public expectations of how companies should operate. And so from the standpoint of Human Rights Watch or any other NGOs, the first step is creating the environment and creating those expectations that will ultimately turn into standards. That is what exposure does, is it points out the excesses of an institution that ultimately will translate into standards. So I always feel that the law follows what the public wants more so than the law being the first thing you see. And it's important to continuously do that because that's actually how change takes place. The second area is actually strengthening good law and following good law. And in that respect, I think if you look at how anti-corruption law has evolved over the last 40 years, it's a perfect example of how a relatively new concept in the 70s has become the norm in the 21st century. And that is a combination of both public advocacy, kind of enlighten companies and lawmakers, but also a recognition by the business sector that this is good for business and internalizing those norms and values, not just because it's a matter of law, but it's actually beneficial to the business over time. The third area, and it's one we've seen over the last few years that people don't talk about, but if you look at things like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights or other issues, is not undermining good law. Right, so we have seen over the last couple of years, and certainly in the last few months, transparency laws that are essential for building the rule of law abroad on the extractive industries and elsewhere under threat and actually revoked, which is counterproductive and contrary to the idea of building the rule of law over time. And the reason for this is because some industries and some companies have taken a very narrow view of the cost of that law without taking a long-term look at what the true benefits will be over time. The final area is actually seeing companies much more aggressive in developing standards and laws that will check excesses by government. And the one example that comes to mind immediately is the surveillance debate, and looking at how the technology industry has been at the forefront of trying to curtail the surveillance powers of the United States in particular. And the reason for that is really twofold. One is because it's wrong, it's a mass invasion of privacy, but the second is a very clear business case in that if one country considers the whole world part of its jurisdiction and is allowed to spy on everyone that isn't a non-US citizen abroad or somebody, a non-US person abroad, then what you have is a problem with the marketplace where the bulk of your customers and clients are not in the US and are subject to these rules, and it creates a commercial problem for you as well. A big reason why big tech companies oppose mass surveillance is because most of their users are in Europe and Asia and elsewhere, and that's where their markets are. They are not going to grow much more in the US or elsewhere, so they have a commercial incentive to see better restraints because it's their users that are going to be the subject of the request to them. So I would say that from a rule of law perspective, you have to expose the problem. You have to work to build norms and standards that will ultimately become law. You have to support existing law that protects human rights, and you can't undermine laws that do that. And that's kind of the perspective we take on these issues.
Great.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Yael Eisenstadt. I recognize I come at this from a slightly different perspective. I spent most of my career in government in the intelligence and national security world. But after government, I went in-house at ExxonMobil and ran their corporate social responsibility strategy, sort of rethinking how to measure impact around the world. So I have lots of thoughts from that perspective on this. And now I advise companies working around the world on how to do so smartly. First, I want to thank Hamid for inviting me, because when he first sent me the topic, I immediately pushed back. My first response was, I don't know that it's companies' responsibility to shape laws overseas. I do believe that companies, I don't think they are obligated to do so. I do think, though, that I'm glad to see more and more companies recognizing the incentive to do so. Recognizing, while I think that companies should absolutely be a positive influence in the rule of law, I don't necessarily know if I believe they have to. But what is nice to see now is that more and more companies really are signing up and believing in the triple bottom line ideas and why it is good for their business to help ensure that the way they operate globally is also good and ethical and follows certain laws. So my comments are more globally focused than U.S. because most of my work has been overseas. And I'm going to focus mostly on the corruption side of things because that's what I've worked mostly on. And at the end of the day, a lot of my comments will mirror some of what our lunchtime speaker was talking about. No matter what, for an American company operating overseas, of course, they have to comply with FCPA, or, for UK companies with the UK Bribery Act. So in and of itself, companies that are operating from the US globally it's not just an incentive. They have to comply with these laws. But what we have seen is that companies really do have a positive role to help other countries bring along their anti-corruption laws. With ExxonMobil, for example, of course, they're members of EITI, which is, I'm going to always get this wrong, so I wrote it down, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And it's a great example of how a company such as a large oil and gas or mining company can help influence the rule of law overseas, because it's in oil and oil extractors or oil exporters' interest to be members of EITI and to be certified compliant. And so in order to do so, they have to be able to demonstrate how they are receiving payments, what payments they're giving out, and it goes sort of across the value chain, from licenses to government contracts to employment. And it's a really powerful way of enforcing anti-corruption laws, even if they're not necessarily in that host country's law books the same way they are in the United States. So a lot of my points, I'll leave it more to the Q&A, will come from that perspective. But on EITI, and I promise not to get political, but this administration did just sign a bill in February that actually is supposed to kill the SEC's rule, which requires American oil and gas and mining companies to disclose some of the details of their payments that are made to foreign governments. And so it will remain to be seen what happens with that, because that directly contradicts EITI regulations to do so. What I did find working, I should caveat, obviously, any comments I'll make about my time at ExxonMobil will be only from things that they state publicly, but they write all of this up in most of their public disclosures and in their corporate citizenship report. But I did find that it's interesting you have these big companies who do recognize it's in their own interest anyway to be as more and more transparent. We recognize some of the bigger Goliath-type companies, it just takes more time to get them to move the needle. But I do think even if this SEC rule goes through, it won't. I would assume it's not necessarily going to change the way most American companies operate overseas. There's still the FCPA in place, and it's still, I think, more and more they recognize it's within their own business interest. But what's nice about something like the EITI is all these other countries and a lot of African countries and Latin American countries want to become compliant, so they find themselves, even if it's not written into their own country's laws, complying with the same types of laws that the United States is bound by. And then, the only other case, I worked on a big case from the investigative side that many of you have probably heard about in Guinea with the mining concessions in West Africa. And my former firm I was at, this was also in the news that they were investigators on this. But here you had this case, right, where you have Rio Tinto and Vale and an Israeli company and the Ghanaian government all on opposite sides of this huge corruption scandal. And I think the lessons, which I'm happy to go into details in Q&A if anyone's interested in that, the lessons out of that whole debacle, and it's still ongoing. I believe a former Ghanaian minister is actually being indicted in the United States now over this case. The whole lesson here is just how if you have a new Ghanaian government who came in and was bound by contracts from the previous government that were all, the licenses and contracts were all acquired in corrupt ways. And so the new government, it's in their incentive now to create their own laws and new, stronger anti-corruption laws so that moving forward, they have one of the hugest reserves of iron ore in the world. They would like to actually be able to benefit from that and for their society and their citizens to benefit from that. So it's in their direct interest to make sure that they have laws that help them be able to do so without all of these corrupt deals that you can read about in the news. It's a hugely complicated case. The one last thing I'll say, though, what I am encouraged by is a lot of the younger companies, a lot of the startups, a lot of the younger entrepreneurs who are working, a lot of the tech companies who are working around the world, I see a lot of them looking from day one to embed these kinds of practices and to really understand the legal landscapes and understand what they can do to, whether it be on the human rights side or on the corruption side, be on the right side, not just be on the right side, but proactively be a good influence around the world. And so while it's harder to move a 100-year-old company quickly in a certain direction, it's encouraging to see so many younger companies actually asking these right questions before they start setting up overseas.
Great. Thanks. I'm going to start with a couple questions. It's unusual to see a corporation choose rule of law as its sort of social mission. So what's worked and sort of why did they choose that and what are the lessons learned?
So we chose that. If you know LexisNexis, you probably know that we've got a strong background in laws. And what our CEO found is that we were doing great corporate social responsibility work, but we were going to hospitals and maybe painting tiles in a hospital, which is great and needed. But what he wanted to do was really funnel our efforts so that there was almost a multiplier effect. And because we are experts in the legal field, we have 10,000 employees who are supporting customers in over 175 countries around the world. So we are partnering with governments because we're publishing their laws or we're working to train their judges or provide them tools. And so I've got a couple of examples where we've used our best practices that have really worked in working with our partners. So our team in Australia worked with the Australian Human Rights Commission because they wanted to have international human rights laws more transparent and accessible. We worked with them on our technology side and helped create a free app called Rights First, which houses the international human rights laws and makes them available on a smartphone. In another example, we worked in a country, the Maldives, that had never consolidated its laws. From what I understand from my colleagues working there, the laws were being sold in paper form on street corners, and you would go and buy the law. And those of us who have the privilege of having our laws in neat little books or now very organized databases don't understand the challenges of just not having the laws easily accessible. Well, that team worked with the government there, and what they found, because they were starting literally from the very beginning, there was no law or word for as amended. And so our team worked with the government to create a new word in the local language, and we stood in the parliament when it was passed. And so that's the sort of thing that our teams have done.
What's the word?
It's
I'm kidding.
Isla, and I hope I'm saying that correctly because languages are not my gift. In a global example, to kind of riff on what Christina said this morning about working with the UN Global Compact, Lexis was the thought process behind the Be for Rule of Law initiative and then the frameworks resulting there too. And it wasn't just the United States, but it was our teams literally across the globe helped to host almost all of the 19 meetings around the world. And we listened to the UNGC as to how to make that work. And what they wanted was diverse voices in the room. Much like this panel has very diverse voices and experience, we needed government, but we also needed legal, business, academic, civil society, and put them all together in a room and really talk, quite frankly, what was the status of the rule of law in their country, and what should businesses be doing to advance the rule of law. Christina took the lead, quite honestly, in taking that back and turning it into a framework that now serves as best practices, if you will, across the globe for any business that wishes to do so.
Oh, that's great. Arvin, you gave what I would call a typical social movement activist view of rule of law, very long-term. First you have to get grassroots, then they have to want it, and law sort of lags behind it. When you talk to businesses, does that resonate with them? Do they consider that to be some sort of part of the reasons why they get involved, or how does that translate? Everyone talks about enlightened self-interest of business, and they have this long-term view, but if you talk to a lot of people in business, it's not so long-term. So what's been your experience partnering with business?
So, I mean, the reality is more like the 5 stages of death. Right? and the reason I say that is, in all of our experience seeing industry come on board to develop standards, it has always come out of either an individual or set of companies that have been enmeshed in a scandal, or competitors in that industry seeing the scandal somebody else went through.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at human rights standards, that has been pretty typical. So what you actually see is there is some expose or exposure of a problem with a company, for example. It could be an oil company, it could be Shell in Nigeria, or it could be Nike in Indonesia with sweatshop-like conditions. And out of that, there'll be a lot of anger at exposure of the problem. And then there would be, and this was certainly true in the mid to late 90s, companies would basically deny it was their problem at all. They would basically say the government is responsible for most of this, and it's their responsibility to fix it. We're just kind of innocent bystanders in the whole problem. Then what typically happens is that pressure doesn't go away, but it's also internalized. So what I've seen a lot is that employees and other managers and others within the company are starting to say to the executives, we don't like what's happening with the company or how the company's being portrayed. And at that point, the company starts accepting there's a problem and ultimately decides to help devise standards to prevent it in the future. So I don't think any institution, whether it's government or companies, operate out of enlightened self-interest alone. I think they operate to the changing environment around them and the scrutiny they're facing. And part of that scrutiny is that there are usually people within the company that realize something needs to change. And that's why you see and have seen over the last 10 to 15 years that most norm setting, whether it's EITI, for example, or other norms, tend to be a collaboration between civil society and the private sector and governments, because that particular expertise is needed from all three. The problem is it's harder to translate that into law. So even when companies say that there are certain norms that should be followed, they tend to resist new law that requires them to follow it, even though it's a better way to go. So for example, your example with Dodd-Frank 1504, that was the culmination of what EITI should have evolved into, but it ultimately was the US oil industry that opposed it as a law. And it was the first law or regulation the Trump administration overturned and Congress overturned, even though when you think about it from a rule of law perspective, it is the perfect building block for rule of law, because all it does is require more transparency around the world.
Right.
So these are some of the challenges, but I would never say that I've seen governments wake up one day or companies wake up one day and say, hey, let's have a new law that restricts the way we operate.
Right.
It's more like, oh my God, we've got a problem, how do we fix it?
It's bad to wait around for death. Sometimes you have to do that. And then the last question, and then I'm going to open it up. Yael, you started saying you pushed back on this topic, and then you were very, very nice and told us these nice stories. I'm going to give you the floor to say why you pushed back a little bit and sort of thinking through what role should businesses play or should not play in sort of thinking about rule of law.
Sure. I mean, the topic itself, I wasn't pushing back on. It was the concept of whether companies should be the ones actually trying to change laws in other countries, as opposed to do I hope they will be, if that makes sense. I don't necessarily agree that it is within their operating. I don't know that it is something that they have to do, but I fully agree with it is something it can be a slippery slope, though. I mean, without going down a whole hornet's nest here, who is also to say which laws an American company or a multinational should or shouldn't influence? Of course, we want human rights laws, and of course, we want anti-corruption laws, but it is a slippery slope when you start talking about multinational corporations overly influencing local law. So we could all get esoteric about this, but I'll try to stick to actual examples. But also to pick up a bit on what the other panelists were saying, I mean, even again in the anti-corruption realm, it's nice to say, I worked, of course, at one of the ones that it was the most sort of complicated to navigate, so I'm trying to be a little bit careful with my comments here. ExxonMobil, it was always very much about, well, what's the law, and once the law comes down, then we will follow it, which is a little odd when on the opposite side, it's not really clear what they are and are not lobbying for separately. But when you're operating overseas, I mean, when you're in a big company and you're trying to win a license overseas, and a Chinese company is going to come in with a suitcase of money and say, well, how are we supposed to compete with that? Then, of course, it's even if you're not doing it from a high and mighty place, it's absolutely in your interest to say, well, for my own competitive interest, I need to figure out how to level the playing field. I do think we're starting to see, though, that there are companies that, I mean, I worked mostly in Africa most of my career, and there was always this question, like Sudan's a great example. When you have the Chinese coming in and just paying everything in Khartoum to be able to do whatever they want to do in Sudan, the question is, someday, will civil society, when they have more of a voice in Sudan, remember that, well, the Chinese did not, they supported this leader who nobody else in the world supports. They had corrupt deals all over the country. Someday, will that reverse, and civil society will be able to rise up and say, we don't want to deal with companies who are willing to support this regime. That goes much more to the human rights side. But again, that's sort of longer term, and I'm getting a little bit off topic. But another one of the challenges also in terms of what you do or don't want to see a company do, I think it's also about how these things are structured within a company. I mean, I know that I was part of a cost center. I was not considered a revenue generator, and we all have dealt with that when you're in a company and you're trying to convince that company to do the right thing. If the company is viewing you as a cost center, then it's a whole another ballgame as well. So it's a question of both internally how to get C-suite to buy into why all of these things are really important, how the company's going to benefit at the end of the day. I personally would never go as far as trying to convince a company that it is in their interest to change laws overseas. I would advocate it is within their interest to be good, responsible citizens, to operate by certain rules and norms, and hopefully, and I think it has played out, and I think there's evidence out there to show that maybe not as fast as we'd all like to see it happen, but the countries they operate in eventually will. I mean, there are stories, I won't go into great detail, of Exxon walking away from a deal because it was not on the up and up, and then that country came back to Exxon afterwards because they wanted to go down the more open, ethical process. So it's, again, I don't know that I would ever consult a company and tell them, I think you should go lobby within that government and force them to change their laws, but continuing to operate from a certain standpoint is going to be both in that other country's interest and in your company's interest at the end.
I think I agree with what you're saying, and I think it comes down to an element of balance. Going to your comment about being a cost center, the first day of my career working within a company, I had an amazing boss who sat me down and said, what you do could be on the front page of the New York Times, and you are the conscience of this company. And if you feel that we are doing the wrong thing, you must state that, even if it's hard, even if we must change the law. I will back you, and you will do what you need to do. And I've taken that directive forward since then. And so there's a time and a place where a voice is needed. How many of us have seen in third world countries where people are proudly holding up their finger and it's marked because they were able to vote for the first time? And so that is a type of having a voice. In the United States, which I've said is my background, having a voice in the legislative process is an important thing. And many companies have a government affairs division with the responsibility of first protecting the business, but then hopefully getting to the point where they're doing the right thing around the world. Going back to the Business for the Rule of Law framework, there was a lovely quote in the framework guidelines that I want to read out because it's just delightful. And this is from a workshop participant in Kuala Lumpur. Workshop participants felt there was a need to call on businesses to speak up more through responsible lobbying, including large multinational companies using their leveraging power as a force for good, to call on governments for consistency and certainty with respect to the rule of the law. So I think there's a couple of things we're talking about, and it goes back to, are you changing the law because it's good for you, or are you changing the law because you're going to make society better? One final point on that. In September of last year, the World Bank released a report on citizen engagement in rulemaking, and it looked at the indicators across 185 countries on what happens when citizens have an active voice in the system. And what they found was that when there is a higher level of citizen engagement, and I would say that businesses are a part of the citizenry, there's a higher quality of regulations passed. There's stronger democratic, lowercase d, democratic regimes, and less corrupt institutions. So with that.
That's great. Just a brief comment. I said there were three reasons, sort of morality, risk, and opportunity. Actually, the morality one was quite interesting because it doesn't happen at the top level of the CO. It often comes through the organization itself. When you walk into these organizations, in terms of internal culture, sort of finding a new generation, people claim that's going to be a movement over time. We hear a lot about risk. We still haven't heard a lot about opportunity, seeing this as a business chance, and perhaps it's another question which we can put forward, but I'm going to open it up for questions now.
Hi, so this is Chris Jochnick with Landesa. I thought the case or the issue that Arvind raised about 1504 and the oil industry's role is just spot on for this event. And I wonder if we could interrogate it a little further, because from Arvind's side, I'm curious if you were satisfied with the response from Yael. And Yael, I'm still trying to understand this because having been a little bit in the trenches during that period, and having worked with Exxon and Chevron in the voluntary principles, Exxon was consistently the most difficult company to work with, always the one dragging its feet in the voluntary principles, and right up there on the front, making sure that 1504, which was transparency and rule of law, never saw the light of day. And yet, Exxon would suggest that it's all about rule of law, and so I'm just trying to understand that. And I don't really understand the economic issue either, because if the concern is that you're going to have the Chinese eating your lunch, then why wouldn't you want more transparency? My sense is that Exxon does quite well in the shadow of these gaps in law, and has done very well for many years, and doesn't feel the motivation yet, I hope it will at some point, to step up to the Chinese and others and really support the rule of law. But, and the facts would seem to bear that out. So I'm just curious, is the issue that the folks like yourselves, and Exxon is a huge bureaucracy, are trying to champion, but you're just not being heard? Or am I somehow misunderstanding, and that Exxon really did have a rule of law interest when it was opposing 1504?
So I'll just start because I think you're going to have more interesting comments for the first half. I mean, this one's hard for me to answer because I'm not at Exxon anymore. I was there for 2 years. I in zero way speak on their behalf. But it's also, obviously, when you leave a place like that, you want to be careful about saying things that you learned in-house there. I agree with what you're saying. I will say it was while the team I worked with and the folks I worked with there all had really, I mean, you mentioned this point about the folks inside being the ones to push for change. Everyone on my team would probably agree with what you just said. Everyone on my team wanted Exxon to be more vocal, more public, more transparent. I pushed frequently for them to actually sign on to the UN Guiding Principles. And there was always a whole long legal answer as to why they wouldn't. So it's a little bit difficult because I clearly agree with your comments. So it's a little difficult for me to actually answer that one. I, again, don't really speak on behalf of the company. I will say, though, it was an interesting, if anything, an interesting learning experience while I was there, because most of these arguments, everyone I worked with in Exxon actually agreed with. But then there's always that, how do we get that through our legal department, and what do we say publicly, and what are we willing to push the boundaries on? And it always, I was in U.S. government for 13 years. It felt like a bigger bureaucracy than U.S. government did. And I think, I mean, silly enough, I think that's where so much of it got lost, was because it was such a bureaucracy. But as much as I want to give a really strong personal opinion on this one, you understand why it's a little bit tricky.
No, I mean, my impression with that industry, but with companies more broadly, is they will be reluctantly comfortable with doing anything that's voluntary, and will fight tooth and nail when it becomes a rule. And if it becomes a rule, then yeah, they'll comply with it, but they'll try and do everything they can to prevent that from happening, because it maintains flexibility. In the case of 1504, it's remarkably short-sighted, because the
Could you
trajectory of 1504...
Just give background for 1504.
That is the law. That's a part of the Dodd-Frank law that requires oil, gas, and mining companies to disclose the payments they make to governments around the world. It's a basic transparency effort that would illuminate a lot of how much money is going to oil-rich countries and others. And the reason it's important is because often in the countries where the worst corruption is, Angola and elsewhere, the public doesn't actually know how much money the government is getting from these operations, because the government withholds it. And this is a way to solve that problem. But why it's short-sighted is because if you look at the example of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the U.S. was alone in 1977 in enacting an act like that. And in the 21st century, many OECD countries have had to. So the U.S. took the approach that it would be a trendsetter and then work to get the rest of the world to come on board with that. And by doing so, it really developed an anti-corruption regime globally that people have to address, even though every country doesn't follow. In the same way, Canada, the EU, and others are adopting similar rules to Dodd-Frank 1504, and everybody has seen the priority of transparency, but it got completely undermined in the country where it started when the administration, with the backing of the industry, overturned that rule first. So it's a very short-sighted way to look at it, because actually the way you would deal with a Chinese company that doesn't want to disclose it is by having rules like 1504 in the US and in the EU, because those are the capital markets they're coming to and the ones they'll be bound to follow in terms of rules when they list publicly. So PetroChina, which is a private sector and listed arm of the Chinese National Oil Company, is also listed on US exchanges, and had 1504 been law, they would have to follow it too. So part of the way you can get at these issues is by making sure more and more people are bound by them. And in a globalized world, it doesn't just mean a national law in China or elsewhere. It could mean an SEC rule that applies to any company that wants to list on US exchanges, for example.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that I brought that law up to begin with hopefully also hints at my feelings on it. But Arvind explained it perfectly.
Let's stay with that topic. There's a lot of expertise in the room. Does anyone else want to follow up, or any other comments?
Hi, my name is Amol Mehra. I'm the executive director of ICAR. I guess I want to question this assumption that the private sector does not have a role as an agent of change, or explore that concept a bit more. I'd love to hear more reflections about this. It is too bad that I didn't ask this question to the previous panel as well, where the general counsels from Microsoft and Coca-Cola were sitting on the discussion. But the question is, I mean, I don't think it's news that companies actively lobby to restrict regulation in other jurisdictions. So I guess the question then becomes is why should we assume that companies could not or should not do the opposite? In fact, engage in efforts and advocacy and lobbying to promote protections in certain jurisdictions. It seems a little bit bizarre to me to throw that away, right? So, and I don't know if Yael, that's what you were getting at about the question
Absolutely not.
about how companies engage in promoting or, in lobbying efforts in jurisdictions. But I mean, I'd like to tease that out a bit more. I think we are seeing more pressure from society looking at companies as agents of change and arguing and using their leverage with companies to get them to step up for rights protections. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
One
Oh.
second. Is the same topic? Yeah, I actually wanted to add to that. One second. Here comes the microphone.
Thank you. I wanted to add to that because I had the same question, but with a slightly different bent. Because when we talk about companies doing foreign direct investment overseas, once they're foreign direct invested overseas, they are a registered entity within that company, a taxpayer. They are essentially have rights within that company, and why shouldn't they advocate? And in a land of stagnating ODA and increasing foreign direct investment, they actually can become a sea of change, a sea of leveraging and potential. So from my perspective, working in and on USAID, DFID-funded type projects, I've actually advocated for civic society engagement from the private sector because they are a legal entity registered within the company and they pay taxes in the country, no matter how corrupt or whatever the situation may be.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of you. Just to be clear, my original pushback was not at all that I think that companies, I work with companies and actually advise them to do so. It's that I don't think they're obligated to. It was more that. But I absolutely agree with you. I think actually more than ever right now, I think the private sector has a larger role to play in being a positive force for change and for good and all of these things. So I absolutely agree with you. And if my pushback originally was the idea, it was really on semantics of how the first email was worded of that they are they obligated to advocate for certain laws overseas? I don't think so. But it's more than just do I want companies to. Customers now are more and more vocal than ever. We all see, with social media, any company's public stance, how they're operating overseas, how they're operating their supply chains, how they're advocating for any rules or laws overseas is all out there, and their customers are demanding that they do the right thing as well. So I fully agree with you that I want to see companies do that. My only pushback was I don't think it's a mandatory thing, but as a customer myself, I want to know that my companies are operating that way overseas as well. If that clarifies a bit.
Yeah, and I mean, just to add to that, you can start from a slightly different baseline. So the way we would approach it is there are standards like the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and others. And if you read them or look at them, at a minimum, if a company accepts those standards, then it shouldn't be advocating for laws that undermine or effectively undermine what those are. And if there's circumstances where advocating for changing laws will help bring a company into compliance or into conformity with it, they should do that too. And there are good examples of that. I mean, if you look at the surveillance debate, for example, a lot of what governments ask companies to do cannot be disclosed. So you can't actually know as a general matter what they've been asked to give, under what circumstances it happened or anything else. But what you can do, and what we saw very early on with the Snowden disclosures and everywhere else, is what some companies would say is, we can't do anything about it, that's a law. And the question we asked is, okay, but if you think the law is bad, then why aren't you trying to change it? Why aren't you trying to get more transparency into the system? Or why aren't you trying to see reforms that would allow government to take on its law enforcement duty, but also protect the rights of people who shouldn't be touched by this law? And so you can start to get an approach that evolves into kind of starting from the standpoint of safeguarding rights and looking at laws through that lens. Would this law or would this regulation have a negative effect, or does it need to be altered to avoid a negative effect? And that may be the starting point to look at.
I would also add in from the business perspective that there's no one cookie cutter way that one does advocacy. One needs to know what the laws are in the country that one is doing the advocacy, and you need to follow and respect those laws, yes. But in the United States, my example, state security breach laws were passed over a series of states over a series of years. And I've personally sat in hallways with a pencil and a yellow pad where the chairman said, give it to me in an hour. And I worked with colleagues to craft up the best of what we knew from other states that had passed similar legislation. So we were crafting laws to give it to the lawmakers, but we also were seeking certain things, certain protections that have been relied on for companies in other jurisdictions so that there was uniformity of application. That, going to the business line, would save costs down the road. You don't want to have a myriad of different laws where they're doing different notices, for example, and you have to change your notice for this jurisdiction but not that jurisdiction. And so knowing that nuance and knowing that and putting it into the dialogue makes a better outcome that helps not just the big companies who can afford to have people interpret it and have them, you know, here's what you do in this state that's different from that state, but also the mom and pop shops and the middle ones who want to be big national companies down the road. They can comply with it too.
Will Pomerantz from the Kennedy Institute. I have a question for Teresa.
Yeah.
You mentioned at the end the importance of citizen engagement in rulemaking
Yes.
as being an important part of rule of law, but it's not in the 4 points that you mentioned into what is actually the definition of the rule of law.
Well, for
And I'm
us,
curious why, if it was emphasized and the notion of legitimacy and raising expectations as to what can be in the law, why was that point not included from your perspective in the definition of rule of law?
going back to what my boss looked at when he created that definition, he created a definition that was easy to remember, but also deeply flexible. And so when you look at the transparency of the law, it's also that process that the law is crafted. And having a transparent process and a participatory process where the people's voices and all the people's voices, it shouldn't just be mine. I think what my colleagues up here have been saying is that it's a better process when everybody's voice is at the table and heard and taken into account. And so I would bucket that into that transparency of the law. And by the way, I was remiss in not saying in one of the other answers that there is an economic impact for businesses. I think John said it quite nicely, that it's the right thing to do, but it's also the business, it's good for the bottom line. But there's also the benefit to the society where you want to do business. And so a year ago, LexisNexis worked with World Bank, World Justice Project, and Transparency International data. And we tracked what happens when the rule of law is enhanced in a country. And what we found is that average life expectancy will go up, homicides will go down, corruption will go down, child mortality rates will go down, and the GDP per capita will go up. So why wouldn't we want to sit at the table if we knew that that was going to be the outcome of putting our voice in the mix with everybody else and having the best outcome by the people responsible for creating that law?
Great.
I'm Frank Brown from the Center for International Private Enterprise. As people who live and breathe these issues every day, and given the fact that the private sector has such a powerful influence over the shape of the rule of law, I wanted to ask you to play prophet for a little bit and look ahead at the next 5 to 10 years and assume that what we're experiencing right now perhaps is somewhat of an aberration. For example, I read when Dodd-Frank 1502, which covers conflict minerals, was being discussed, there was several corporations came forward and said, whether we have 1502 or not, we will still comply because our consumers don't want to use a mobile phone with Coltran from the DRC that was obtained through slave labor. And that's a pretty powerful statement about what the new normal is. And so it's a bit of a long question, but my question to you is if that sort of is an indication of where we're headed, and if things like what Tom Firestone were talking about come to fruition, where the bribe takers are subject to prosecution under FCPA, and if we see things like the International Anti-Corruption Court, which Judge Mark Wolf up in Boston advocates, come to life, and if if, as Matthew Murray and Andrew Spalding argued recently in a paper, freedom from corruption should be considered a human right. If all these things sort of indicate the way of the future, what would the world look like in 5 to 10 years? Or is this question absurd? Is this a naive?
I'd say you just described the SDGs. Because that's going to be the world in 15 years. And there's very good people, including Business Voices and others, who are trying to prognosticate that right now.
So, yeah, I mean, I think it's evolving. So, I mean, to your first point, so for those that don't know, Section 1502 is a conflict minerals provision of Dodd-Frank that requires companies to disclose and audit their supply chains to make sure they're not getting 4 conflict minerals from the Congo. And the 3 companies that spoke out, the Trump administration and Congress want to overturn that law. They have not yet, even though it was supposed to have been overturned the first week they were in session. And Apple, Intel, and Tiffany publicly said they wanted the law in place and they would comply no matter what. And there are several reasons for it. Number one, they had already put a lot of time and money into complying with the law since it had been enforced for several years. Number two, Intel had actually commissioned a study on millennials. Now what they found is that roughly 75% of millennials, when they understood the issue of conflict minerals, were pretty adamant they didn't want them in their products. So Intel saw very clearly that their future customers have expectations on them that they have to address. And then finally, what all 3 companies have realized is that this is what levels the playing field for them, that if they are going to comply with these rules, they would like to see others comply with the rules, otherwise they're put at a competitive disadvantage against companies that don't follow such rules and are comfortable with seeing money go to armed groups and things like that. So what I would say is the future is evolving at first into an era of disclosure. So regardless of the kind of anti-regulatory wave that's taking place in the US, in Europe, in places like France and elsewhere, the laws on disclosure around human rights are growing, they're not shrinking. And so what I expect to see over the next 10 or 15 years is many, many jurisdictions that will touch on multinational companies in particular will have these types of rules in place. And we're already seeing that. And over time, we'll start seeing certain jurisdictions holding companies or individuals accountable for not respecting human rights or doing these things. So I think we're in the first wave that kind of Dodd-Frank brought in of seeing more disclosure around the world and more pressure on companies to disclose these kinds of issues.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I think you describe a bit of a utopia if that happens. But this is actually part of why I brought up the idea of, more and more it's customer driven as well. I mean, it was interesting when I conducted this big benchmarking study of all the major corporations, not all the major, but a big range of corporations, their different disclosures and their sort of CSR or corporate citizenship or whatever term you want to use, profiles. And it was interesting. Apple was really actually at the bottom of the list for quite a while. Apple actually, even on the philanthropic side, they really are not, they're not the biggest example of corporate citizenship. But more and more as customers are starting to actually engage and starting to actually demand things, you have this example. And it's interesting because the mining industry from the DRC, I mean, it's even more complicated because then it goes through China and then it's made from China and it gets back to your Apple product here, and actually even tracing that is extremely difficult. But seeing Apple be one of the 3 companies to stand up to me was incredibly refreshing. It showed that they are listening to, I mean, we can pretend it's because the head of Apple cares so much. Maybe he does, but I'm going to assume it's more about recognizing what his customer base is going to demand. So I actually think what you describe is a great case. I don't know if 5 years from now we will be there. I think part of the problem will be an over-inundation of information. It is too quick to be able to immediately accuse a company of something without actually having enough fact and analysis to back up what you're demanding. But I do think more and more companies, I would hate to think it's because they are constantly in crisis mode and just trying not to anger their customers, and hopefully they see that, as you brought up, by following certain norms, ethics, and practices, they're actually making a positive contribution, which helps society and helps accomplish the SDGs and all of that. But I do actually think it will be largely customer driven as well. So hopefully what you're saying prevails as opposed to all this rolling back of regulations right now and what that might actually do.
So I'm going to jump in here perhaps because I just like playing the devil's advocate at times. This assumption that these changes are going to be customer driven is a good one, but I'm not quite sure it's completely true. I just finished a very large project on Walmart's sustainability program. So over the last 10 years, we moved from their speeches about sustainability to what they actually implemented 10 years later. And they told the same story. Sustainability, rule of law, very abstract concepts which nobody really knows what they mean, and people come together and agree on it. But when it comes down to the actual detail, what does it mean? What's a sustainable product? So Love Earth and sort of Conflict Minerals, and they created a jewelry where you could trace it down the supply chain, and we have cases, and we did lots of interviews within Walmart. And what happens is they discovered that someone lied to them down the chain, and that a investigative journalist went down to Bolivia, and they found out that this was just simply not true. And Walmart pulled it. They stopped doing it because the risk is up, and we wrote it in our case, and we had students, you can't find it even on their website anymore. And we follow these cases again and again. And the punchline is, when you look at this, is that Walmart's customers really don't care. They don't care. They're not willing to pay more money for it in terms of their lifestyles. And if you look at the customer base, it's actually a bifurcated market that upper middle class cares. And if you have the money, you're willing to pay. And when you get down to lower income, they're not willing to pay. Now, the punchline, it's not a pure negative story about Walmart. And if you're interested in more detail, is they created something we call low-cost sustainability. They said, we'll accept any initiative or innovation that sort of has less environmental impact but doesn't raise the price, right? And then you can just start blowing your mind about what that doesn't include. And then they tried to label products and all these sort of things. So these stories, these are very complex stories. And I'm not convinced that that customer-driven changes, and this is why you get into multi-sector collaboration. You actually see Walmart pushing a lot of this just because they stated some very high sustainability goals.
Yeah, if I can pick up on that, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I was trying to think of a way to say this without sounding terrible, but there are different customer bases, and customers who buy their iPads and iPhones might not necessarily be the exact same customer, or might have different lever points, but then Walmart customers who don't want to pay more money for what they're buying. So I absolutely agree with you. It is for us to assume that customers, especially across the United States, are going to necessarily drive positive change all the time, I just think is not really realistic. It's not really taking into account our actual entire society, but it doesn't mean that customers are not driving certain things like Apple saying we don't want these minerals in our product. I mean, it would be very hard for me to believe that was not a largely customer-driven idea there.
Yeah, and I don't assume the vast majority of customers pay attention to a lot of these issues, but I also think price sensitivity can be looked at a different way too, right? So if tomorrow we say something like all meat, right, will be $5 cheaper, and the cost of that is getting rid of the FDA, people are probably not going to agree to it. And what that speaks to is why regulation at a fundamental level for social purposes, environmental, food safety, or human rights, is so critical, because that's what's going to level the playing field and internalize that cost for the company, right? And it's only through a large number of companies having to do the same thing do the costs ultimately come down in a meaningful way. So it shouldn't be a discussion as to whether Walmart on its own decides that protecting a right is going to cost the customer X more. The real discussion should be everybody in that sector should be protecting the right, and it's a cost of doing business. And that's where regulation becomes very important, because unless you level the playing field that way, you run into these issues constantly.
Right.
And can I just add another point on the Walmart thing? When I mentioned earlier how hard it is to actually trace a mineral from the DRC to China this is actually one that I did work on, and that's why, I mean, Walmart, I think some of their initiatives are actually, very well thought out, but you have to be careful when you have an initiative without really making sure you've figured out all the details of how you're going to be able to actually prove it. Which, strangely enough, is one of the reasons, getting back to Exxon, it was a little bit harder. Exxon's such a data-heavy company that they're not going to sign on to anything without about 8,000 data points of why this will succeed. So that particular initiative is the perfect example of, I'm not sure who they consulted on how easy it is to actually trace the life of any one of their pieces of jewelry, but it is excessively complicated. You still want it to happen, but you also have to be, it does take investment up front on the research side of figuring out what you can accomplish, how you can trace things. You have to be willing to hire people who will actually investigate it. And that's the other problem. Then it starts to sound like it's a cost center issue. And I do still believe you can make the case of why it's something worth doing. You just internally have to be able to figure out how to build that case.
Right.
And while we're not a retail store, I'd say any business has someone that's going to put pressure on them doing the right thing. And so we're using the example of customers. We had one of our salespeople in a country unnamed was asked to pay a bribe. We have procedures, and that individual went through the procedures and very bravely stood up to that country and said no. Well, it went up to my boss's level. He's the general counsel, and he backed that individual and moreover said, we will not do business in this country. Well, what we found was we did that because it was the right thing to do, but the outcome was other customers of ours, who are very frequently business, came to us and said, thank you for standing up to this. We weren't working with you, or we weren't working with you at this level, but now we're going to enhance what we're doing with you because we really appreciate that you stood up to this. Long story short, down the line, that country asked us back when they changed their practices. But what I'd say is, and I think we've talked a little bit about around this, it comes from the top down and it comes from the bottom up. It may be that the CEO or the higher level leaders have a directive, but it takes the bravery of the individual rank and file employees to say, I'm going to do the right thing. And maybe it's the millennials who will notice, and maybe they want to work with a company that's putting their money where their mouth is, because quite frankly, it's expensive to hire people, train them, and have them leave for another business. My boss has also said that that is now frequently the very first question asked in an interview. What are your corporate social responsibility practices and how do you involve with them? Well, that's very different from what was happening even 5 years ago. So going to Frank's question about what's moving the needle and what will we see down the line, the SDGs are going to be more and more apparent, and all of the member states of the UN adopted these, and business is a key partner. Every country that is a part of the UN said they are going to do these things, and a component of that is SDG 16, peace, just, and secure institutions. But I would challenge you and say that much like that foundation, it is the foundational bedrock of every single one of the SDGs. You want zero poverty? How are you going to do it with a corrupt government? You want life on land? How are you going to feed people if there's no justice system for people to be able to use? So,
Yeah. Complex causation, sorry. Any questions?
I have a question using my prerogative, which is earlier we spoke about the life cycle of rule of law and that life cycle may be changing in light of, for example, the expediency of things like financial flows, which are happening now instantaneously and are affecting different societies in different ways. I'm also wondering, conversely, as we talk about customer demands altering how corporations act, whether or not social media is that same catalyst. I mean, it's hard to imagine that we can be in the same room talking about airline practices, forgetting the fact that I flew United here and not thinking in the back of my mind what might be captured. And to me, it seems like as much as we are talking about customer demands in the abstract, in some ways it only requires one video, one discrepancy, one revelatory moment to cause the very crisis moments which you expect. So I'm not so sure. I would question the notion that you need some sort of larger aggrandizement of customer sentiment. You just need the one typical moment that catalyzes change. Does anybody want to react to that?
I mean, I think I would look at it slightly differently. I don't think what happened with United or a lot of other issues is happening any differently than it happened in the past. It's just happening more quickly, right? So you know, if you go back 100 years to The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, it was one book that led to changes in the meatpacking industry that created the FDA, right? So it was slower temporally, but it wasn't any different than a cell phone video that spread quickly. So the same thing is happening, right? Social change, or the change in behavior of companies, is happening primarily because of exposure and now the immediacy of public pressure on it. But fundamentally, it's no different than how changes happen over a century. It's just that now it can happen faster. And another way to look at it, I mean, that's one. Within a week, Congress was talking about regulation. Every airline had changed its practices and everything because they knew the cost of that. But if you look at something like tax justice and tax avoidance and tax evasion, it took Oxfam and others just a few years to make what was typically just a business issue into a social justice issue, and that's stuck, and it's coloring how people are making policies and elsewhere. So in today's world, it can just happen a lot faster.
Yeah, I mean, on the social media side, I don't know what the effect in terms of the rule of law question is, but what is interesting, I mean, the United case is obviously in a lot of people's mind, but what is interesting is we're finding that traditionally, most big companies, they had their firm that they used for their crisis situations, and it's usually a communications or PR firm, right? And they wait until a crisis hits, and then they go to that firm and they say, what should we do? How do we get out of this crisis? And that firm's going to draft up their press releases, their media statements. Personally, I think it looked like United didn't even get the best counsel on that right away. But so now you do actually, it is a good moment to seize on rather than coming to me after a crisis. Let's start looking at this ahead of time. And this is a little, not so much on the rule of law, but just how do you engage in society and trying to convince companies to be more proactive rather than reactive to crisis. And it's interesting, I've been talking with a few communications firms in New York recently, and even they're starting to sort of reassess their practice areas and not just having this crisis practice to deal with after you do something awful, but more of a holistic, and some of them are calling it, one was calling it corporate impact, of how do you preemptively think of all the things that you shouldn't be doing wrong to begin with. And yes, mistakes happen, and how do you handle it when they do? I mean, but what's interesting too, social media, obviously, we can see an onslaught of reaction from social media that is justified or is not. What's really interesting about the Uber and Lyft debacle in New York, if you guys remember this one, my initial thought on that was, yes, Uber surged and sent cars to the airport, to JFK, right after this law, the ban came down, and that created this big delete Uber debacle. And at first I thought, well, that's social media outrage that I'm not sure if that's well placed. But then with more and more coming out about Uber, I realized although Uber has had a whole litany of issues of how they treat their employees, of how they treat other people, that I think was already starting to brew. And it's more that created this social media outrage afterwards. And I don't know if they're really going to recover from it. So, I mean, that was very long-winded, sorry. But it's not, for me, it's not so much about the rule of law, but I do think social media, it plays a part in it because nobody wants to be. I mean, I hate to say this as well, when talking to clients now about their risk and their whole risk profile, one of the biggest questions we get is, well, what if the president mad tweet me? What if he tweets about me? And now you have to factor that into your profile too, and that's social media on a whole nother level. So hopefully at the very least it helps companies start to be more proactive as opposed to reactive on any number of social issues. I don't know if that goes as far as creating a huge difference in how laws are changed, but it could at least create a difference on how companies act.
I'd say that how you react to social media is going to be very similar to how we react and act around laws. And so when a new law is passed, we have a system called a circle of compliance, where you look at the law, You look at what your current practices are. You do a gap analysis. Where do your practices not meet with the law? You change your policies where you need to. You educate your team so that rank and file person knows to say no. And then you monitor, you audit how you're doing, and then you continue. And so much like social media, as you said, it's getting faster. It's getting harder. And so you have to have a working circle in place of experts in compliance, corporate communications, across your company to respond and to have the system in place. It's like insurance. You buy it ahead of time. You hope you don't ever need it. But gosh, if you don't have it, that's going to be a real problem.
We should be closing up. I should just thank you very much. Thanks for all the panelists. It was very interesting, sort of the risk and opportunity. I'm hearing a lot of risk, and sort of it's becoming a risk issue, a crisis issue, as opposed to an opportunity and selling more stuff, which is going to be the drivers. But luckily, we have in the next 5 to 10 years to actually figure out what's going on. Thank you very much.